There's a number that governs your life. You feel it every morning when the alarm goes off at precisely the wrong moment, pulling you from depths of sleep you desperately need. You see it on your clock at night when you calculate how many hours remain before you must wake. 8. 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours for everything else. A perfect division of the day into 3 equal parts, each exactly 1/3 of your existence. But here's what makes this remarkable. This division, this sacred mathematics of your daily life, didn't emerge from modern sleep science. It didn't come from 20th century labour movements, though they fought for it. It didn't originate with industrial efficiency experts, though they measured it. The 8-hour division of time, the basic system that creates our minutes and hours, the very structure of how you measure your waking and sleeping life, all of this comes from clay tablets pressed by reed styluses in southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. The same civilization that gave us the first cities, the first written language, the first mathematical systems also gave us the framework for how long you should sleep and how long you should work. And if you follow certain translations of those ancient texts, if you read between the wedge-shaped lines of cuneiform script, you find something stranger still. A story of beings called the Anunnaki who came to Earth with a problem. They needed workers. They needed a species that could labour in shifts, that could be organised, controlled, made productive. According to these controversial interpretations, they didn't just create humanity. They created the schedule we still follow. The 8 hours of sleep wasn't chosen for your benefit. It was the minimum rest period needed to keep a workforce functional. Your body still remembers this. Every time you accumulate sleep debt, every time you push through exhaustion to meet a deadline, every time you sacrifice rest for productivity. You're following a script written in the dust between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers when the world was young and the workday was first being designed. So tonight, as the blue light from your screen suppresses your melatonin production and the weight of tomorrow's obligations keeps you scrolling just a few minutes longer, I want you to consider something. What if your exhaustion isn't a personal failure? What if the constant struggle between the sleep your body demands and the schedule your life requires isn't a modern problem at all but an ancient design feature? What if you were built to be perpetually just tired enough to keep working, but rested enough to continue? Before we drift deeper into this mystery, if you find yourself drawn to these quiet revelations, a gentler light helps others discover these nocturnal journeys. Leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, what time it is there as you hear these words. Are you fighting sleep or surrendering to it? And remember, you won't need the visuals for this. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the ancient world emerge not on a screen, but in the darkness behind your eyelids, in that space where sleep and consciousness meet. Now, let the day fall away, dim whatever lights remain, and let me take you back to the very beginning, to the moment when time itself was first divided into hours, when sleep became something that could be measured, controlled, rationed out like grain or water or any other resource necessary for survival. The rhythm of your sleep isn't arbitrary. Every cell in your body operates on a clock that's been ticking for millions of years, a biological metronome set to the rotation of a planet you've never consciously felt spinning beneath you. This is your circadian rhythm from the Latin circa, dies, approximately a day. It's written into your DNA with the same permanence as the colour of your eyes or the shape of your bones. Deep in your brain, in a cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, sits what scientists call your master clock. It's barely larger than a grain of rice, but it conducts an orchestra of biological processes that spans your entire body. When light enters your eyes each morning, it sends a signal to this tiny conductor, resetting the clock, telling every cell in your body what time it is, what it should be doing, whether it should be preparing for activity or rest. This isn't a modern development. This isn't something that evolved when humans invented agriculture or built cities or created shift work. This clock has been ticking in our ancestors for hundreds of millions of years, slowly refined by the relentless pressure of natural selection. Animals that couldn't predict the coming of day and night, that couldn't prepare their bodies for the demands of each phase, they didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. The ones that did survive, the ones whose internal clocks most accurately track the external world, they became our ancestors. Here's what that ancient clock does while you're not thinking about it. As evening approaches and light begins to fade, your master clock triggers the pineal gland to start producing melatonin, a hormone that makes you drowsy. Your body temperature begins to drop, falling to its lowest point around 4 a.m. Your blood pressure decreases, your digestion slows, your immune system shifts into a higher gear, producing more infection-fighting cells while you sleep. All of this happens automatically, without your conscious input, following a program that's been running since before your species had language to describe it. Scientists have tested this. They've put people in caves and bunkers, in sealed rooms without windows or clocks or any external cue about what time it is. Cut off from the sun, from schedules, from alarm clocks, from everything that might tell them when to sleep or wake, humans naturally settle into a rhythm of about 24 hours and 11 minutes. Not 24 hours exactly, not random, but close enough to Earth's rotation that our ancestors could synchronize their internal clocks to the external world with just a few minutes of adjustment each day. This adjustment happens through light. Your eyes contain special cells, different from the rods and cones you use for vision. These cells contain a photopigment called melanopsin, and they respond specifically to blue light, the wavelength that dominates the sky during the day. When these cells detect blue light, they send a signal directly to your master clock, advancing or delaying your rhythms to keep them aligned with the sun. This is why the light from your phone screen is so destructive to your sleep. It's not just that it keeps your mind active, scrolling through social media or checking emails, it's that the blue light it emits is telling your master clock that it's still daytime, that it's not yet time to produce melatonin, that you should stay alert and awake. You're essentially giving your brain conflicting information. The darkness of night saying sleep while the light from your screen saying wake, and your circadian system doesn't know which signal to trust. But here's what makes this relevant to our story of ancient schedules and cosmic workers. This biological clock, this deeply embedded need for cyclical rest, it creates a problem for anyone who wants to maximize productivity. Left to its own devices, the human body doesn't want to work continuously. It wants to alternate between periods of activity and rest, not just daily but throughout the day. You feel this as the afternoon dip, that drowsy period around 2 or 3 p.m. when your alertness naturally decreases, even if you've slept well the night before. You feel it in the way tasks that seemed impossible at night become manageable after sleep. You feel it in the mounting cognitive debt that accumulates when you push past your body's signals for rest. If you were designing a workforce, this would be a significant engineering challenge. You'd need to account for this biological imperative for sleep. You couldn't eliminate it. The research is clear that chronic sleep deprivation leads to physical and mental breakdown, but you could optimize it. You could figure out the minimum amount of rest needed to keep your workers functional while maximizing the time they spend laboring. You could divide the day into segments that balance productivity with the unavoidable necessity of sleep. And here's the strange thing. When you look at how the day actually came to be divided, when you trace back through the layers of history to find who first decided that 8 hours was the right amount of time for sleep and 8 hours for work, you don't find modern science or enlightened labour reform. You find something much older. You find clay tablets and sexagesimal mathematics in a civilization that arose in southern Iraq around 3000 BCE, with knowledge that seems to have appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if it had been handed to them by someone who had already worked out the solution to organising a productive society. Let me take you there now. Close your eyes and feel yourself moving backward through time, past the factories of the Industrial Revolution, past the Scientific Revolution, past the fall of Rome and the glory of Greece, past the pyramids of Egypt, back to a time when the world was measured differently, when the stars seemed closer, and when the boundary between human and divine was thought to be much thinner than we imagine it today. You're standing on the bank of a river that doesn't exist anymore. The Euphrates has shifted its course many times since the days when this city flourished, but in your mind's eye you can see it as it was, a broad, slow-moving ribbon of brown water carrying the runoff from distant mountains. The air is thick with heat and dust and the smell of mud bricks drying in the sun. This is Sumer, the land between the rivers, the place that changed everything. The light here is different from anything you know in your climate-controlled modern world. The sun is a physical presence, a weight pressing down on everything it touches. By midday it will be intolerable, sending people into the shade of their mud brick houses, forcing even the most ambitious work to pause. But now, in the cool of early morning, the city is already awake. You can hear the sound of stone on stone, grain being ground for bread, the bleat of goats being led through narrow streets, the murmur of voices speaking a language that died thousands of years before Latin was born. Walk with me through these streets and you'll see something that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth at this time. Organization, structure, a society arranged not by kinship or tribal allegiance, but by function, by specialization, by a division of labor that allows thousands of people to live together in a concentrated space. There are bakers and brewers and weavers and potters and metalworkers and scribes, each person contributing a specific skill to the whole, each dependent on the others for things they don't produce themselves. This is new. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small bands of related individuals, hunter-gatherers who moved with the seasons and the game. Then suddenly, in this river valley and a few other scattered places, everything changed. People started staying in one place. They started growing food instead of gathering it. They started building permanent structures, keeping records, developing hierarchies of power. They invented what we call civilization. But invention might be the wrong word, because according to the texts these people left behind, according to the stories pressed into wet clay and hardened into permanence, they didn't invent civilization. They were taught it. They were given it by beings they called the Anunnaki, which in their language meant something like the princely offspring or those who from heaven to earth came. Now, we have to pause here and acknowledge what we're doing. We're standing at a crossroads between two very different interpretations of the same evidence. On one path, the mainstream academic view, the Anunnaki were simply Sumerian gods, mythological personifications of natural forces, the normal religious constructs of an ancient culture trying to make sense of a world they couldn't fully understand. On the other path, the controversial ancient astronaut theory, the Anunnaki were something else entirely. Extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth with advanced knowledge and specific needs, who created or modified humanity to serve as a workforce, who left behind instructions and systems that we still follow without understanding their origin. I'm not here to tell you which interpretation is correct, but I am here to show you why the question matters, why it's more than just an academic debate about dusty tablets in museum basements. Because regardless of whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or mythologizing memories of early human rulers, the systems they supposedly established, the mathematics, the timekeeping, the organization of labor, these things are real. These things shape your life, and these things appeared in Sumer with a sophistication that still puzzles historians who study the period. Let me show you what I mean. Let's talk about numbers, about how the Sumerians counted and why it matters that you still use their system every single day without realizing it. The Sumerians didn't count the way you do. They didn't use a base 10 decimal system built on the number of fingers on your hands. They used something called sexagesimal mathematics, a base 60 system that seems impossibly complicated until you understand its advantages. The number 60 can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. It's what mathematicians call a highly composite number, meaning it has more divisors than any smaller number. This makes it extraordinarily useful for calculations, for dividing things into portions, for commerce and astronomy, and any situation where you need to work with fractions. This is why there are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. This is why a circle has 360 degrees, which is 60 times 6. This is why we still measure geographic coordinates in degrees, minutes, and seconds. The Sumerians developed this system over 5,000 years ago, and it was so effective, so mathematically elegant, that every civilization that came after them kept using it. The Babylonians inherited it, the Greeks adopted it, the Romans used it, the medieval Islamic scholars preserved it. And now, in the age of computers and atomic clocks, you still divide time using the exact same base 60 framework that Sumerian scribes pressed into clay, when the pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. But why? Why would a civilization that was supposedly just emerging from prehistory, just figuring out how to farm and build cities, why would they choose such a sophisticated and unusual number base? The standard explanation is pure practicality. They needed to divide things, to measure, to trade, and base 60 made those calculations easier. But some researchers ask a different question. What if they didn't choose it at all? What if they inherited it from somewhere else? This is where the ancient astronaut theorists point to the texts. Not just the myths and epics, but the accounting records, the astronomical observations, the mathematical tables. Because here's another strange thing about Sumer. They knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. They had accurate calculations for the orbital periods of planets that can't be seen with the naked eye. They understood precession of the equinoxes, a 25 and a 20-year cycle, that requires centuries of continuous observation to detect. They had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. How? The mainstream answer is patient observation over many generations, careful record keeping, the gradual accumulation of knowledge. The alternative answer is that someone showed them. Someone who already knew how the solar system worked, who had already done the calculations, who gave them a ready-made framework for understanding the cosmos. And if someone did show them, if there were teachers or gods or visitors who brought this knowledge, then we have to ask what else they might have taught. What other systems might have been handed down rather than developed, including perhaps the optimal division of time for organising a workforce. Let me take you inside one of these clay houses, into a room lit by oil lamps, where a scribe is working late into the evening. The clay tablet in front of him records something that seems mundane, a list of workers and the hours they've laboured, the rations they've earned. But look closer at how that time is recorded. The day is divided into 12 units, each unit divided into these smaller segments. The work period is measured, recorded, calculated with precision. 8 hours of labour, 4 hours for a midday rest during the worst heat, 4 hours for an evening meal and family, 8 hours for sleep. It's all there, worked out in sexagesimal mathematics, the same division of time that you follow today without questioning where it came from or why it feels natural despite being completely arbitrary from a biological perspective. Because here's what sleep science tells us. Humans don't naturally sleep for exactly 8 hours in a single block. Before the advent of artificial light, before industrialization and alarm clocks and fixed work schedules, people slept differently. Historical records and anthropological studies of pre-industrial societies show a pattern of segmented sleep. People would sleep for several hours after sunset, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, a period they used for prayer, conversation, reflection, or intimacy, and then sleep again until dawn. Total sleep time was often longer than 8 hours, maybe 9 or 10, split into 2 main periods with a wakeful interlude. This pattern makes biological sense. It aligns with the way your sleep cycles naturally unfold, with periods of deeper and lighter sleep occurring in roughly 90-minute intervals. 8 continuous hours is actually slightly awkward for these rhythms, often leaving you in the middle of a deep sleep cycle when you need to wake, which is why you sometimes feel groggier after 8 hours than after 7.5. But 8 continuous hours has a different kind of logic. It's the logic of organisation, of predictable schedules, of maximising productive time while providing enough rest to maintain function. It's not optimised for human biology, it's optimised for workforce management. And that brings us to the most controversial part of the ancient texts, the part that mainstream scholars dismiss as mythology and ancient astronaut theorists claim as evidence. The story of why the Anunnaki needed workers in the first place. The texts, particularly the Atrahasis epic and various Sumerian creation myths, tell a story about labour and rebellion. According to these accounts, when the Anunnaki first came to Earth, they did the work themselves. They dug canals, they mined, they toiled. But the work was hard and the junior gods, the ones called the Agigi, grew tired of it. They burned their tools, they surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief administrator, and they demanded relief. The solution proposed by Enki, the god of wisdom and craftsmanship, was to create a new kind of worker. The texts describe a process that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering. They took the essence or blood of a sacrificed god, something that contained intelligence or spirit, and mixed it with clay, with the terrestrial material of Earth. This mixture was placed into the wombs of birth goddesses, and from it emerged the first humans. The Lulu-Amalu, the mixed workers, created specifically to bear the burden of labour that the gods no longer wished to carry. Now, if you read this as pure mythology, it's a creation story like many others, explaining human origin through divine action. But if you read it as Zecharia Sitchin did, if you interpret clay as a primitive way of describing DNA or biological material, and if you interpret the blood of a god as genetic information from an advanced being, then the text becomes something else. It becomes a description of creating a hybrid species through biotechnology, combining the genetics of an existing hominid species on Earth with the genetics of the Anunnaki to produce something new, something that could think and speak and follow instructions, but something that was also designed from the beginning to work. And if humans were designed as workers, if that was the core purpose of our creation according to these texts, then it makes sense that our basic parameters would be optimized for labor. 8 hours of sleep isn't what we would choose for ourselves if we were free to follow our natural rhythms. It's the minimum rest period needed to maintain productivity. It's a feature, not a bug. This would explain something that puzzles sleep researchers. Despite overwhelming evidence that most adults need 7 to 9 hours of sleep for optimal health, despite clear documentation of the cognitive and physical impairments caused by chronic sleep deprivation, despite knowing better, we consistently sacrifice sleep for work. We wear exhaustion as a badge of honor. We feel guilty for sleeping too much. We structure our entire society around pushing people to be productive even when they're tired. It's as if there's a deeper programming at work, something that makes us believe that work is fundamentally more important than rest, that sleep is time wasted rather than time invested in health and cognition. As if we were built with a bias toward labor that overrides our biological need for adequate sleep. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to Sumer, to the moment when this system was first being established, and show you how it spread across the world. The Sumerian civilization didn't last forever. Like all empires, it rose and fell, conquered and absorbed by new powers. The Akkadians came first, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. Each new culture adopted and adapted Sumerian innovations, including their mathematics and their methods of timekeeping. The sexagesimal system spread throughout Mesopotamia, into Persia, across to Egypt and the Mediterranean. When the Greeks encountered this knowledge, they were astounded by its sophistication. They incorporated Babylonian astronomy into their own scientific traditions. They used the base 60 system for measuring angles and time. They passed it on to the Romans, who spread it across Europe. The medieval Islamic scholars preserved and expanded it during the Dark Ages. And when Europe emerged into the Renaissance, when modern science began to develop, it built its timekeeping on this ancient foundation. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived, by the time factories needed to coordinate the labour of hundreds or thousands of workers, the framework was already in place. Time was already divided into hours and minutes using the Sumerian system. The day was already understood as a 4-hour cycle, though the division into 3 8-hour segments, work, rest and leisure, that would take the labour movement of the 19th and 20th centuries to firmly establish. But even that movement, even the hard-fought battles for the 8-hour workday, were arguing within parameters that had been set thousands of years earlier. Robert Owen, the Welsh textile manufacturer who popularised the slogan 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest, in 1817, he didn't invent the division. He was advocating for a return to proportions that felt natural, that felt right, even though most workers at the time were labouring 12 to 16 hours a day. Why did 8 hours feel right? Why did that become the goal rather than 6 hours or 10? You could argue it's mathematical elegance dividing the day into 3 equal parts. You could argue it's the maximum work time that can be sustained without severe health consequences. But you could also argue that it's embedded in our cultural memory, passed down through the millennia from those first Sumerian clay tablets, an echo of the original design specifications for the human workforce. Let me show you what happens when you don't get those 8 hours, when you accumulate what scientists call sleep debt, and why this matters for understanding how our biology intersects with our schedules. Your body doesn't forgive sleep deprivation. It accumulates it like financial debt, with interest that compounds over time. If you need 8 hours of sleep but only get 6, you don't just have a 2-hour deficit for that day. Those 2 hours carry over. The next night when you only get 6 hours again, you now have a 4-hour deficit. After a week of 6-hour nights, you're operating with 14 hours of sleep debt, nearly 2 full nights of missed sleep spread across your week. The effects are measurable and profound. After even 1 night of insufficient sleep, your cognitive performance declines. Reaction times slow, attention wavers, memory consolidation, the process by which your brain transfers information from short-term to long-term storage, becomes impaired. After several nights, the deficits accumulate. Studies show that people who sleep 6 hours a night for 2 weeks perform as badly on cognitive tests as people who have been awake for 48 hours straight. But here's the insidious part. The chronically sleep-deprived people in the study didn't feel that impaired. They had adapted to their deficit. Their subjective sense of sleepiness plateaued even as their objective performance continued to deteriorate. This is what's called the paradox of adaptation. Your body adjusts to chronic sleep debt. You stop feeling as desperately tired as you did during the first few days of restriction. But the adjustment is only superficial. The underlying damage continues. Your immune system weakens, making you more susceptible to infection. Your endocrine system destabilizes, disrupting hormones that regulate hunger, stress, and metabolism. Chronic sleep deprivation is associated with increased risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even certain cancers. The mechanisms are well understood now. Sleep isn't just rest. It's an active biological process during which your brain clears out metabolic waste products that build up during waking hours. It's when your immune system produces infection-fighting cells. It's when your body repairs cellular damage and your brain consolidates memories. Cut that process short and the waste products accumulate, the infections gain a foothold, the repairs go unfinished, the memories fail to form properly. And yet we structure our entire society around insufficient sleep. School start times that force teenagers to wake before their circadian rhythms have completed the sleep cycle. Work schedules that demand early arrivals and late departures. Culture that valorizes the productive grind and treats sleep as a luxury rather than a necessity. Why? The standard explanation is capitalism, productivity culture, the demands of modern technological society. But those are recent developments. The pattern is older. The trade-off between sleep and work, the acceptance of chronic exhaustion as the price of civilization, that goes back much further. This is where we have to look at what the Sumerian texts say about how humans were expected to function, and how closely that matches the way we actually live. The administrative tablets from Sumer, the ones that record rations and work assignments, they paint a picture of a highly organized labor system. Workers were divided into groups and shifts. Their output was measured and recorded. They were provided with food and beer, the staples of the Sumerian diet, in amounts calculated to maintain their ability to work. It's the first large-scale example of workforce management, and the principles it established, measured time, standardized compensation, organized schedules, these became the template for every civilization that followed. The texts describe different classes of workers. Some had more autonomy, more skilled positions. Others were labourers, doing the hard physical work of building and digging and hauling. But all of them operated within a system that balanced their labour against their maintenance costs. Feed them enough to keep them strong, give them enough rest to keep them functional, but don't give them so much of either that they have excess energy or time to question the arrangement. It's a chilling echo of the creation myth. According to the Atrahasis epic, humans were created specifically because the gods wanted to offload their labour. The entire purpose of the species in that telling is to work, and the optimal design for a working species is one that can be sustained on minimal resources while producing maximum output. 8 hours of sleep is about the minimum you need to avoid immediate cognitive and physical breakdown. It's not optimal for long-term health. It's not what your body would choose if it were free to sleep until it wakes naturally. But it's sufficient to keep you functioning, to let you work another 8 hours the next day and the day after that and the day after that, until the cumulative damage from never quite getting enough rest builds up into chronic health problems decades down the line. If you were an engineer designing a workforce, if you needed them to be productive but not so healthy, and rested that they had the energy to question their circumstances, 8 hours would be a very clever compromise. Now, I need to be clear about something. I'm not saying definitively that this is what happened. I'm not claiming that the Anunnaki were real extraterrestrials who genetically engineered humans and programmed us to accept insufficient sleep. What I am saying is that the pattern is there. The texts describe a scenario of workforce creation. The mathematics they use still governs our time. The division of the day they established is still what we fight over in labour negotiations, and the chronic sleep debt we all carry, the exhaustion that modern society treats as normal, it fits perfectly into a framework where humans are optimized for labour rather than well-being. The mainstream explanation is that these are coincidences, that we independently arrived at similar systems because they're practical, that the 8-hour division feels natural because it's mathematically neat. But there's another possibility, that we follow these patterns because they were established so long ago, so early in the development of civilization, that we've forgotten they were ever a choice. We treat them as natural laws when they're really just very old rules. Let me take you back one more time to ancient Sumer, but now we're going to look at something that makes even skeptical academics uncomfortable. The sheer sophistication of what appeared there all at once in what should have been a primitive agricultural society. Within a few centuries, the Sumerians went from simple farming villages to complex urban centres with specialised occupations, written language, advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge, large-scale architecture, organized religion, and legal systems. That's an explosive development. Most civilizations take thousands of years to achieve that level of sophistication, evolving gradually through trial and error. But in Sumer, it seems to have emerged almost overnight in historical terms. Their writing system, cuneiform, appears suddenly in a nearly complete form. Yes, there are earlier pictographic precursors, but the transition to a full syllabic script that can represent complex abstract concepts happens very quickly. Their mathematics, including the sexagesimal system, and advanced astronomical calculations shows up at the same time. The standard explanation is that we're missing the intervening steps, that the archaeological record is incomplete, and if we found more evidence we'd see a gradual development. But we've been excavating Mesopotamian sites for over a century now. We've found thousands of tablets, tens of thousands, and the pattern remains: sudden sophistication. The alternative explanation, the one that ancient astronaut theorists propose, is that the Sumerians had help, that the Anunnaki were real, whether as extraterrestrials or as some other advanced civilization, and that they gave the Sumerians a ready-made package of knowledge. Not developed gradually but taught quickly, like uploading information rather than learning it through experience. If that's true, if there was some form of knowledge transfer, then we have to ask what else might have been included in that package. The mathematics certainly. The astronomy, the writing system, the organizational structures for managing large populations, and perhaps also the social programming, the assumptions about how humans should function within those organizational structures, the 8-hour workday, the acceptance of labor as humanity's primary purpose, the trade-off of health for productivity. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence, though mainstream scholars don't interpret it this way, is the Sumerian king list. This document records the rulers of Sumerian cities, going back to before the Great Flood, and it gives their reign lengths. The antediluvian kings, the ones who supposedly ruled before the flood, have impossibly long reigns: 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Mainstream academics treat these as purely mythological numbers, symbolic of divine authority rather than actual time periods. But here's what's interesting. When you divide those numbers by the 3600 Sitchin's proposed orbital period for the planet Nibiru, you get much more reasonable figures. A king who reigned for 36,000 years actually reigned for 10 Nibiruan years. It's like the difference between measuring distance in miles versus kilometers. The number seems impossibly large until you realize you're using the wrong unit of measurement. Is this real evidence? Or is it finding patterns where none exist? Numerology masquerading as archaeology? The mainstream says the latter. But it's worth noting that 3600 itself is significant in the sexagesimal system. It's 60 core, 60 squared, a shah in Sumerian mathematics, represented by a large circle. And circles, cycles, orbital periods, these concepts are all linked in Sumerian thought. What we know for certain is this. The Sumerians had sophisticated timekeeping. They divided the day into units that we still use. They created a mathematical system that still governs how we measure hours and minutes and degrees. They left records describing the creation of humans as a workforce for gods who needed labor. And we, their descendants, whether literal or cultural, we still organize our lives around the same divisions, the same balance of work and rest that appear in those ancient texts. Let me bring you forward now, through the millennia, to the moment when the 8-hour workday became law, and show you why it matters that this happened not through science or reason, but through struggle. The Industrial Revolution turned humans into machines in a very literal way. Factories needed workers who could keep pace with mechanical processes, who could stand at a loom or a forge for as long as the machinery could run, and the machinery, unlike human workers, didn't need rest. It could run 24 hours a day if you fed it fuel and provided maintenance. The obvious solution was to work humans in shifts, rotating them through so the machines never stopped. But how long should each shift be? In the early days, the answer was as long as possible: 12 hours, 14, 16 children, as young as 6 working dawn to dusk in mines and mills, their small hands useful for reaching into machinery that would crush an adult. The health consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Workers died young. They developed diseases from the polluted air and contaminated water of industrial cities. They suffered accidents from exhaustion and lack of attention. The social consequences were equally severe. Families disintegrated when parents and children worked different shifts and never saw each other. Communities fractured. The crime rate soared. Revolutions threatened. It was unsustainable. But the solution that emerged, the 8-hour workday, it didn't come from employers suddenly developing compassion. It came from workers organizing, striking, sometimes dying in clashes with police and private security forces. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, where workers rallying for 8-hour days were involved in a bombing that killed 7 police officers and 4 civilians. The decades of organizing and legislation that followed. The slow, grudging acceptance by the industry that 8 hours might actually be more productive than 16, because exhausted workers make more mistakes and produce lower quality output. Henry Ford gets credit for popularizing the 8-hour day in 1914 when he cut his workers' shifts from 9 hours to 8 and doubled their pay. But he didn't do it out of kindness. He did it because the turnover rate at his factories was killing productivity. Workers were quitting as soon as they saved enough money to try something else. The shorter day and higher pay were a strategy to retain workers and reduce training costs. But here's what's fascinating. The goal was always 8 hours, not 7, not 6. Even the most radical labour reformers, the ones calling for revolution rather than reform, they fought for 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours for what we will. It was Robert Owen's slogan from a century earlier. It was the division that felt natural, that seemed fair, that balanced the needs of production against the requirements of human biology. Except it doesn't really balance those needs. 8 hours of sleep is borderline inadequate for most adults. 7 to 9 hours is the range that sleep researchers recommend, and many people function better at the higher end of that range. But we've structured our society around 8, as if it's a magic number, as if going below it is disaster, but going above it is negligence. Why? Because the other 16 hours are already spoken for. 8 for work, 8 for everything else, commuting, eating, family time, personal care, the brief moments of leisure we're allowed between the obligations. If we admitted that we need 9 hours of sleep, that would mean 1 less hour available for labour or consumption. The whole system would have to adjust. So instead, we maintain the fiction that 8 is enough, and we shame people who need more as lazy or weak. This is the genius of the system, if it is a system. It's not enforced through violence or obvious coercion. It's enforced through normalization, through making anything else seem unreasonable. You internalize it. You feel guilty for sleeping late. You pride yourself on functioning on less sleep than you need. You wear exhaustion as a status symbol, proof that you're working hard, sacrificing, contributing, and your body breaks down slowly, imperceptibly in ways that won't become obvious until you're well past your prime working years. High blood pressure, diabetes, cognitive decline, depression, all linked to chronic sleep debt, all developing slowly enough that you don't connect them to the sleep you've been missing for decades. If you were designing a system to extract maximum productivity from a workforce while ensuring they don't have the energy or mental clarity to question the arrangement, you couldn't do better than this. Give them just enough rest to keep them functional, but not enough to let them truly recover. Make them complicit in their own exhaustion by tying their identity and worth to their productivity. And most importantly, make it all seem like their choice, their responsibility, their failure if they can't keep up. The Sumerian texts describe humans as made to bear the workload of the gods. Made, not asked, not given a choice, but designed for a purpose. And while we can debate whether that's literal history or symbolic mythology, we can't debate that we've built a civilization that functions as if it were true. Every time your alarm goes off and you drag yourself out of bed despite your body's desperate signals that you need more rest, you're participating in a system that's older than Christianity, older than the Roman Empire, older than the pyramids, a system that divides time into units invented in ancient Mesopotamia, that expects you to work for exactly 8 of those units, and that provides you with 8 units for sleep, not because science determined that's optimal, but because that's the traditional allocation, the numbers that balance productivity against the minimum maintenance required to keep you alive and working. Let me show you what your body is actually doing during those 8 hours, and why they're barely enough to complete the necessary process. Sleep isn't a single state. It's a cycle that repeats multiple times throughout the night, alternating between different stages that serve different biological functions. The deepest stage, called slow-wave sleep, is when your brain clears out waste products through the glymphatic system, a recently discovered network that's only active during sleep. It's when your immune system produces the most infection-fighting cells. It's when your body does the majority of its physical repair work, healing damaged tissues and building new cells. Then there's REM sleep, rapid eye movement, the stage where most dreaming occurs and where your brain processes emotions and consolidates memories. During REM, your brain is almost as active as when you're awake, but the activity is focused inward, strengthening neural connections, integrating new information with existing knowledge, working through emotional experiences. Each complete cycle through these stages takes about 90 minutes, so in an 8-hour night you get maybe 5 or 6 complete cycles. But here's the complication. The proportion of time spent in each stage changes across the night. Early cycles have more slow-wave sleep, later cycles have more REM. If you cut your sleep short, if you consistently wake after only 6 or 7 hours, you're disproportionately losing REM sleep because that's concentrated in the later part of the night. The consequences of REM deprivation are subtle but significant. Emotional regulation becomes harder. Your brain literally has less capacity to process and integrate emotional experiences, making you more reactive, more prone to anxiety and depression. Memory formation suffers. Creativity decreases. Your ability to make connections between disparate pieces of information, to see patterns, to solve problems, all of this depends on REM sleep. And slow-wave sleep, if you're not getting enough total sleep, you're also likely not getting enough deep sleep for your brain to fully clear the metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. One of those waste products is beta amyloid, a protein that in high concentrations forms the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. Chronic sleep deprivation, especially in midlife, is now recognized as a significant risk factor for developing dementia decades later. This is what you're trading when you sacrifice sleep for work. Not just tomorrow's energy, though that too. You're trading away the maintenance and repair systems that keep your brain and body functioning properly. You're accumulating damage that won't become apparent until it's too late to reverse. And you're doing this not because you want to, but because the entire structure of modern life demands it. Early work start times, long commutes, the expectation of being available via email or phone outside of official work hours, the social pressure to be productive, to have side hustles, to always be improving and optimizing and grinding. There's a term in sleep medicine now, insufficient sleep syndrome. It's a recognized disorder, not insomnia where you can't sleep, but voluntary sleep restriction where you could sleep but you choose not to because other demands on your time seem more pressing. It affects an estimated 1/3 of adults in developed countries. 1/3 of the population is chronically, voluntarily sleep deprived because fitting adequate sleep into their lives would require giving up something else that feels necessary. This brings us to the question I've been circling around, the core of this mystery. Is this by design? Is there a reason, whether planned by ancient visitors or emergent from the structure of civilization itself, why we've created a society that makes adequate sleep so difficult? Let me offer you 3 possibilities, 3 ways of interpreting the same facts, and you can decide which makes the most sense to you. The first possibility is pure coincidence. The Sumerians developed a base 60 mathematical system for practical reasons. It spread because it was useful. The 8-hour division of time happened independently in the modern era because it's a mathematically neat way to divide a day, and it roughly approximates the minimum sleep humans can survive on while still being productive. Our chronic sleep debt is a consequence of capitalism and technology, not ancient design, just a modern problem without deeper significance. This is the mainstream view. It's reasonable. It doesn't require any controversial assumptions, but it does require you to accept a lot of independent coincidences, all pointing in the same direction. The second possibility is cultural programming. The Sumerians did establish these systems, and they spread so widely and lasted so long that they became embedded in human civilization. Not through genetics, but through culture, through the accumulated weight of tradition and habit. We follow 8-hour schedules because our ancestors did, because it's the template we inherited, because changing it would require rebuilding society from the ground up. In this view, there's no conscious design, ancient or modern, just the momentum of a very old system that we've forgotten how to question. This is more interesting. It suggests that we're trapped by our own history, following rules that might have made sense in a different context, but that we now maintain out of inertia. It means we could change if we had the collective will to do so, but that will is difficult to muster when the entire global economy is built around these divisions of time. The third possibility is the one that brings us back to the Anunnaki. What if the system really was designed, whether by extraterrestrial visitors or some other advanced civilization that existed before recorded history. What if humans were created or modified specifically to be workers? And what if the 8-hour sleep allocation was part of the original design specifications? What if we struggle against our biology, sacrificing sleep for work? Not because capitalism demands it, but because something older and deeper has programmed us to value labour above rest. In this view, every civilization that has arisen since Sumer has been operating within parameters that were set at the very beginning. The base STE mathematics, the division of the day, the assumption that humans exist to work. These aren't emergent properties of civilization, they're the foundation it was built on, installed by whoever or whatever first taught the Sumerians how to organize a complex society. This is the most controversial interpretation. It's the one that academics dismiss as pseudoscience and conspiracy theory. But it's also the one that explains the most. Why does the same mathematical system from 5,000 years ago still govern how we measure time? Why does the division into 8-hour blocks feel natural, despite being suboptimal for human biology? Why do we willingly sacrifice sleep, health, years of our lives to maintain productivity levels that no one actually chose but everyone treats as necessary? If we were designed as workers, if that programming is embedded deep enough that we can't easily override it, then all of this makes a terrible kind of sense. I'm not going to tell you which interpretation to believe, but I will tell you this. Regardless of the origin, the effect is the same. We live in a world where the minimum acceptable rest period is treated as the standard, where exhaustion is normalized, where the vast majority of people are chronically sleep-deprived and suffering the health consequences, but continuing to follow schedules that perpetuate the problem. And we do this using a system of timekeeping that hasn't fundamentally changed since it was pressed into wet clay in ancient Sumer by people who claimed they were taught by beings called the Anunnaki. Those beings might have been gods or aliens or just exceptional human innovators. But the system they left behind, that's real. That shapes your life every single day. That determines when you sleep and when you wake and how you measure the passage of time. So as you lie here, as your mind drifts and your body begins its nightly work of repair and consolidation, I want you to think about this. The time you're spending asleep right now, these hours you're devoting to rest, they're measured in units created by people who are dust. The division of your day into work and sleep and everything else, it follows a pattern older than any religion you know. And the exhaustion you feel, the constant battle between what your body needs and what your schedule demands, maybe that's not a modern problem. Maybe it's a very, very old one. The Sumerians believed the Anunnaki would return one day, that Nibiru, if it exists, will complete another orbit and bring them back to Earth. What would they think if they came back now? Would they be surprised that we still use their mathematics, still divide time the way they taught us? Or would they expect it? Would they see it as evidence that their design worked exactly as intended, that humanity is still functioning within the parameters they established? More importantly, what would they think of what we've become? We've built a technological civilization beyond anything they could have imagined. We've split the atom, we've mapped the human genome, we've sent machines to other planets, we've created artificial intelligence. But we still can't figure out how to get adequate sleep. We still sacrifice our health and sanity to maintain productivity. We still organize our lives around work as if it's the primary purpose of existence. If we were designed as workers, we're very good ones. We're so good that we've built a civilization that demands we work ourselves to exhaustion, that treats rest as weakness and sleep as time wasted. We've internalized the programming so completely that we don't even recognize it as programming anymore. Or maybe we were never designed at all. Maybe we created this trap ourselves through countless small decisions over thousands of years, each generation passing on slightly more demanding schedules, slightly less sleep, slightly more emphasis on productivity, until we arrived at this moment where 1/3 of the population is chronically sleep-deprived, and we all just accept it as normal. Either way, the result is the same. You're lying here now, hopefully drifting towards sleep, and the time you have for that sleep is limited. 8 hours if you're lucky, less for most people. Measured in units created in ancient Mesopotamia, allocated according to divisions that appeared at the dawn of civilization. Tomorrow morning your alarm will go off. It will interrupt whatever sleep stage you're in. You'll wake, probably tired, and begin another cycle. 8 hours of work or close to it. 8 hours for everything else. 8 hours that you're supposed to spend here in this vulnerable state of unconsciousness, trusting that your biological systems know what they're doing, that the waste products will be cleared and the memories consolidated and the repairs completed. But 8 hours is barely enough, and you know this. Your body knows this. Every time you hit the snooze button, every time you sleep late on weekends trying to pay back the debt that accumulated during the week, every time you drink another cup of coffee to force yourself alert despite your screaming need for rest, your body is telling you that the allocation is insufficient. So why don't we change it? Why don't we collectively decide that 9 or 10 hours of sleep is the standard, that work schedules should accommodate human biology rather than the other way around, because the system is bigger than any individual, because changing it would require coordinated action across the entire global economy, because we've been doing it this way for so long that we've forgotten it's possible to do it differently, or because we can't change it, because the programming is too deep, too old, too fundamental to who we are as a species. Because 5,000 years ago, someone or something established these parameters, and they've been running ever since, invisible as air, shaping civilization without us even noticing. The mystery isn't whether the Anunnaki were real, or what they wanted, or whether they're coming back. The mystery is why we're still following rules that might have been arbitrary, that might have been designed for someone else's benefit, that clearly don't optimize for human well-being. Why we accept exhaustion as normal. Why we structure our entire civilization around the minimum rest period needed to maintain basic function. But before we drift too far into speculation, let me take you back one more time through history. Because there's something I haven't told you yet. Something that makes the 8-hour division even stranger. For most of human history, people didn't sleep the way you're trying to sleep right now. They didn't lie down for 8 continuous hours and then wake. They did something different. Something that your body might still remember. It's called segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, and it was the dominant pattern across pre-industrial Europe, and potentially across much of the pre-industrial world. Let me describe it for you, because it changes everything about how we understand the relationship between sleep and civilization. Imagine you're living in England in the year 1500. The sun sets early, maybe around 5 p.m. in winter. There's no electric light, just candles and oil lamps, and they're expensive. Most people can't afford to burn them for hours every night. So as darkness falls, your family goes to bed. Not because you're tired enough to sleep for 12 hours, but because there's not much else to do in the dark. You sleep for 3 or 4 hours, deep restorative sleep. Then around midnight or 1 a.m, you wake, naturally. Not from an alarm or a disturbance, but because your body has completed its first cycle of rest. And here's what's strange to modern ears. This was expected. This was normal. There were even words for it. In English, people spoke of first sleep and second sleep. In French, it was premier sommeil and second sommeil. In Italian, primo sonno. The period between first and second sleep lasted 1 to 3 hours. And people didn't lie there anxious about their insomnia, fighting to fall back asleep. They got up, they did things, they prayed, they had sex, they visited neighbours, scholars wrote by candlelight. Criminals committed crimes under cover of darkness, people ate light, snacks, reflected on their dreams, which were reportedly more vivid at this hour, talked with their families by the fire. Then, when they felt tired again, they went back to bed for their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. Total sleep time was often 9 or 10 hours, but split into 2 distinct blocks with a wakeful interlude. This pattern shows up everywhere in historical records once you start looking for it. Court documents, medical texts, prayer books, novels, diaries. In 1667, a physician named Louis Cerveau wrote about the benefits of the wakeful period between sleeps for digestion. In 1611, a character in a Ben Jonson play says, "I would it were morning," and is told why it is after first sleep. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from the 14th century, there are references to first sleep, as if everyone would know what that meant. The practice wasn't limited to Europe. French missionaries in 16th century Brazil reported that the Tupinamba Indians eat at night after their first sleep, and then return to sleep. In 19th century Muscat, the capital of Oman, residents were said to complete their first sleep before midnight. The pattern appears in Middle Eastern, African, South Asian and Latin American sources. It seems to have been, if not universal, at least widespread across pre-industrial societies. Then something happened, starting in the late hundreds among the urban upper classes of Northern Europe and spreading gradually over the next 2 centuries. References to segmented sleep began to disappear from the written record. By the early 1900s, the practice had vanished so completely that when historian Roger Ekirk discovered evidence of it in the 90s, it was treated as a revelation. An entire pattern of human sleep once common enough that it needed no explanation, had been forgotten so thoroughly that modern scholars didn't know it had ever existed. What killed segmented sleep? The standard explanation points to three interconnected factors. First, artificial lighting. As street lamps spread through cities, first oil lamps, then gas, and finally electric lights, the night became less dangerous and more usable. People could socialise, work, read and entertain themselves later into the evening. They went to bed later, which compressed the available time for sleep. Second, the Industrial Revolution and the transformation of work. Factories needed workers to arrive at specific times and work in coordinated shifts. You couldn't have some workers following the natural rhythm of segmented sleep, waking at midnight to putter around for an hour, while others maintained a consolidated schedule. The entire system required synchronization, standardization, the same hours for everyone. Third, a cultural shift in how sleep was perceived. In pre-industrial times, sleep was valuable. It was associated with health, with spiritual contemplation, with the restoration of the soul. But as capitalism took hold, as productivity became the measure of worth, sleep began to be seen as time wasted, a necessary evil but nothing more. The less sleep you needed, the more productive you could be, and productivity was virtue. The consolidation of sleep into a single block, ideally 8 hours or less, fit perfectly into this new worldview. It was efficient. It maximised the time available for work and consumption. It turned sleep from a complex biological process with its own internal rhythm into a simple maintenance function. Fill the tank, get back on the road. But here's what makes this relevant to our story of ancient schedules. Segmented sleep, while it might not have been universal, was clearly more aligned with natural human biology than the consolidated 8-hour block we practice now. And we know this because when researchers recreated pre-industrial conditions in laboratory settings, people spontaneously returned to segmented sleep patterns. In the early 90s, psychiatrist Thomas Weir conducted the landmark experiment at the National Institute of Mental Health. He took healthy young men and put them in a room with no artificial light for 14 hours each night, simulating long winter nights before the advent of electric lighting. For the first week or so, the subjects slept for about 11 hours, catching up on accumulated sleep debt. But by the fourth week, something remarkable happened. They spontaneously shifted to a pattern of segmented sleep. 4 hours of sleep, 2 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, then another 4 hours of sleep. Even more interestingly, during the wakeful period between sleeps, the subjects showed unusual hormone levels. Low cortisol, the stress hormone, and elevated prolactin, a hormone associated with calm and restfulness. Dr. Ware noted that the men seemed to be in an altered state of consciousness, not unlike meditation. They weren't tired or anxious during this wakeful period. They were alert but calm, contemplative, at peace. This suggests that segmented sleep might not be a cultural invention, but a biological response to certain environmental conditions, specifically long nights without artificial light. When the night lasts 12 or 14 hours, as it does in winter at higher latitudes, the human body might naturally divide that time into 2 sleep periods with a wakeful interlude, rather than trying to sleep continuously for the entire duration. If this is true, if segmented sleep is indeed more natural than consolidated sleep in certain conditions, then the 8-hour block we now practice is even more artificial than we thought. It's not just a matter of timing or duration, it's a fundamentally different pattern, one that violates the way human sleep naturally structures itself when freed from the constraints of electric light and industrial schedules. And this brings us back to Sumer, to those clay tablets, to the question of how sleep was organised at the very dawn of civilization. Because here's what's interesting, the Sumerians didn't have electric light. They had oil lamps, yes, but they were expensive and dim. They didn't have industrial schedules, at least not in the modern sense. Their work was seasonal, tied to agricultural cycles and the availability of natural light. So did they practice segmented sleep? The tablets don't tell us directly. There's no Sumerian text that says first sleep and second sleep the way medieval European texts do. But we know they divided the day into 12 double hours using their sexagesimal system. We know they organised work shifts, we know they had sophisticated timekeeping, and we know that the 8-hour division, whether for work or sleep, became embedded in their cultural systems so deeply that it survived for 5,000 years. This raises a provocative question. What if the consolidation of sleep into a single 8-hour block didn't begin with the Industrial Revolution? What if it began in Sumer? What if one of the first acts of civilization, one of the first steps in organizing masses of people to work together on large projects, was to override the natural rhythm of segmented sleep and impose a more efficient schedule? Think about it from an organizational perspective. Segmented sleep, with its variable wakeful period and individualized timing, is a nightmare for workforce management. You can't coordinate hundreds or thousands of workers if some of them are waking at midnight and others at 2 a.m., if some need 1 hour between sleeps and others need 3. You need standardization. You need everyone sleeping during the same block of time and awake during the same block of time. The 8-hour consolidated sleep period solves this problem. It's not optimal for the individual's biology, but it's perfect for organizing labor. Everyone sleeps from the same hour to the same hour, everyone wakes at the same time, everyone is available for work during the same daylight hours. It's efficient in exactly the way that segmented sleep is not. If the Anunnaki or whoever designed the Sumerian system were trying to create a productive workforce, they would need to suppress segmented sleep. They would need to train people to sleep in a single consolidated block, even though that's not how human biology naturally works in the absence of cultural conditioning. And they would need to make that consolidated sleep as short as possible while still maintaining function, which means right around 8 hours. The 8-hour sleep schedule in this view isn't just about the duration, it's about the pattern. It's about overriding a natural biological rhythm, segmented sleep that responds to seasonal changes in daylight, and replacing it with an artificial one, consolidated sleep that serves the needs of organized labor. And once that pattern was established, once it was embedded in the cultural DNA of civilization, it spread wherever civilization spread, eventually becoming so ubiquitous that we forgot there was ever another way. Now, I need to be clear. This is speculation. We don't have direct evidence that the Sumerians deliberately suppressed segmented sleep, or that they even thought about sleep in these terms, but we do know that they established systems that required temporal synchronization. We do know that consolidated sleep became the norm as civilizations developed, and we do know that this norm persists despite being suboptimal for human health and well-being. The question is whether this is conscious design or emergent property. Did someone, whether Anunnaki or human rulers, deliberately choose to structure sleep this way? Or did it just evolve naturally, as the demands of organized society made segmented sleep increasingly impractical, until eventually it disappeared without anyone making a conscious decision to eliminate it? Either way, the effect is the same. We now live in a world where the natural pattern of sleep, the one our bodies spontaneously return to when freed from artificial light and imposed schedules, is considered a disorder. Middle-of-the-night insomnia, waking at 2 a.m. and lying there anxious about not sleeping, this is one of the most common sleep complaints in modern industrialized societies. But historians like Roger Ekirch suggest that it might not be insomnia at all. It might be your body trying to engage in segmented sleep, waking for the intersleep period that it expects to have, and then becoming confused and anxious when you fight to immediately fall back asleep instead of accepting the wakefulness as natural. If this is true, if millions of people diagnosed with insomnia are actually experiencing echoes of a more natural sleep pattern, then we've medicalized a normal biological function, we've turned a feature into a bug, and we treat it with sleeping pills and cognitive behavioral therapy when the real problem might be that we're trying to force our biology to conform to a schedule that was designed for workforce efficiency rather than human well-being. This is the deepest layer of the mystery. Not just that we follow ancient systems, not just that we accept exhaustion as normal, but that we've forgotten what natural sleep even looks like. We've lost the memory of segmented sleep so completely that we pathologize the remnants of it when they appear in our own bodies. We think we're broken when really we're just remembering something very old. And if the Sumerians were the ones who first began this process of forgetting, if they were the ones who started training humans to sleep in consolidated blocks to serve the needs of organized labor, then the clay tablets take on an even more sinister significance. They're not just recording a schedule, they're recording the moment when human biology was first systematically overridden for the sake of productivity, the moment when we stopped sleeping the way our bodies wanted to sleep and started sleeping the way civilization needed us to sleep. Let me take you deeper still because there's more to this story. More evidence that the way we sleep now, the way we think about sleep, has been shaped by forces much older than we realize. The clay tablets from Sumer don't answer these questions. They just record the system, the divisions of time, the organization of labor, the mathematical framework that we inherited, and never questioned. The answers, if there are answers, might be buried in those same tablets in the parts we haven't translated or haven't understood. Or they might be written in our biology, in the genetic code that determines how we sleep and wake and respond to schedules that violate our natural rhythms. Consider what happens to your brain during those 8 hours of sleep, assuming you actually get them. Your glymphatic system, a network of vessels that clears metabolic waste from your brain, becomes 10 times more active during sleep than during waking. Cerebrospinal fluid pulses through your brain tissue, washing away proteins like beta amyloid that accumulate during the day, and that, if allowed to build up over years, form the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. But here's the crucial point. This clearing process takes time. It's not something that can be rushed or abbreviated without consequences. Studies suggest that you need at least 7 hours of sleep for adequate glymphatic function, and more is better. When you consistently sleep less than 7 hours, when you accumulate chronic sleep debt, you're literally allowing toxic proteins to accumulate in your brain tissue. Over decades, this contributes to neurodegenerative disease. The same is true for immune function. During deep sleep, your body produces infection-fighting cells and antibodies. Restrict your sleep and you become measurably more susceptible to infection. Studies have shown that people who sleep less than 7 hours a night are 3 times more likely to develop a cold when exposed to the virus than people who sleep 8 hours or more. And metabolic function. Sleep restriction affects the hormones that regulate hunger and metabolism. Leptin, which signals satiety, decreases. Ghrelin, which stimulates appetite, increases. This is why chronically sleep-deprived people tend to gain weight. They're literally hungrier, their bodies trying to compensate for the energy deficit created by insufficient rest. All of this is well-documented science. We know that 8 hours is barely adequate for these processes. We know that most people need closer to 9 hours for optimal health, and yet we've structured our entire society around providing 8 hours or less, as if the minimum acceptable threshold is the same as the ideal. This is the signature of a system designed for productivity rather than well-being. Give the workers just enough rest to keep them functional, but not so much that they have excess energy or time to do anything other than work and consume. It's elegant in a cruel sort of way. The population remains perpetually tired enough to be compliant, but not so exhausted that they can't perform their duties, and it's self-sustaining because people internalize it. You feel guilty for sleeping 9 hours. You brag about functioning on 6. You wear your exhaustion as a badge of honor, proof that you're working hard, sacrificing, contributing to the greater good. The programming runs so deep that you police yourself, that you voluntarily restrict your own sleep even when you have the opportunity to get more. Or maybe there are no answers. Maybe there's just this, the perpetual tension between the sleep your body demands and the schedule your life requires. The nightly negotiation of how many hours you can spare for rest versus how much you need to accomplish tomorrow. The slow accumulation of sleep debt that modern life treats as the price of civilization. But what if you could change it? What if, knowing all this, knowing about segmented sleep and circadian rhythms and the Sumerian origins of timekeeping, you decided to structure your sleep differently? To prioritize your biology over your schedule, to reclaim those lost hours of rest? The truth is you probably can't. Not entirely. Because the system is bigger than you. Your job requires you to be there at a certain time. Your children's school starts at a certain hour. The bus runs on a schedule. The grocery store is only open certain hours. The entire infrastructure of modern life is built around the assumption that everyone follows the same temporal framework, the same divisions of time established 5,000 years ago in Sumer. You can optimize within that framework. You can practice good sleep hygiene, keep a consistent schedule, avoid blue light before bed, create a dark, cool sleeping environment. But you can't fundamentally restructure your sleep to align with your natural biology if that biology is incompatible with the schedule society demands of you. This is what makes the mystery so profound. We're trapped in a system we didn't choose, following rules we didn't make, organized around divisions of time that were established before anyone alive today was born. And those divisions may have been arbitrary, or they may have been deliberately designed to maximize productivity, or they may be the legacy of extraterrestrial visitors who created us as a workforce, but regardless of their origin, they shape your life in ways you can't easily escape. Before I let you drift completely, there's one more thread I need to follow, one more connection between the ancient world and your modern exhaustion. because the story doesn't end with the Sumerians or even with the Industrial Revolution. It continues right into your present moment, into the specific way that modern corporations and institutions have refined these ancient principles into something even more efficient at extracting productivity while maintaining the appearance of concern for worker well-being. Consider the modern office, that pinnacle of knowledge work civilization. Walk through any corporate campus and you'll see all the trappings of enlightened employment. Comfortable ergonomic chairs designed to support your spine during long hours of sitting. Free coffee and snacks to keep your energy up. Maybe a gym or a meditation room, symbols of the company's commitment to wellness. Flexible work arrangements, the ability to arrive between 8 and 10 a.m. as long as you work your 8 hours. But look closer and you'll see something else. You'll see the same fundamental mathematics that appeared on Sumerian clay tablets. 8 hours of expected work, maybe more if you're salaried and ambitious. 8 hours allocated for sleep, though the company doesn't directly control this. 8 hours for everything else, your commute and meals and family, and the fragments of personal time you can salvage from the wreckage of your day. The modern corporation has perfected something the Sumerians could only dream of. They've made you internalize the schedule, made you enforce it upon yourself, made you feel that any deviation from maximum productivity is a personal moral failing rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable system. They measure your work in ways the Sumerians never could. Time-tracking software that logs every minute you spend on different tasks. Productivity metrics that quantify your output. Performance reviews that rank you against your colleagues. All of it designed to ensure you're using those 8 hours as efficiently as possible, that not a moment is wasted, that you're producing maximum value for the wages you're paid. And here's the genius of it. They frame all of this as being for your benefit. The time tracking helps you manage your workload better. The productivity metrics give you concrete goals to achieve. The performance reviews help you grow and develop. It's all wrapped in the language of personal development and career advancement, but the underlying purpose is the same as it was in ancient Sumer. Extract maximum labor while providing minimum rest. The difference is that modern corporations can't simply command your obedience the way ancient rulers could. They have to secure your consent, your voluntary participation in a system that exhausts you. They do this through a subtle manipulation of status and identity. Working long hours becomes a mark of dedication. Sacrificing sleep becomes evidence of commitment. Burnout becomes a badge of honor, proof that you gave everything to the company. You see this in startup culture particularly clearly. The glorification of the 80-hour work week, the celebration of sleeping in the office, the contempt for work-life balance dismissed as something only lazy or uncommitted people need. It's repackaged as entrepreneurial spirit, as hustle culture, as the price of success. But strip away the marketing and it's the same equation. Maximum productivity, minimum rest, normalized exhaustion. And it spreads beyond startups. Law firms expect associates to bill 2,000 hours a year or more, which requires working far more than 40 hours a week when you account for non-billable time. Medical residents work shifts that regularly exceed 4 hours, despite overwhelming evidence that sleep-deprived doctors make more mistakes and provide worse patient care. Investment banks, consulting firms, tech companies, they all have their own versions of the same demand. Give us everything you have. Sleep is for the weak. The justification is always the same. This is temporary. Once you make partner, once you exit the startup, once you prove yourself, then you can rest. But that time never comes. The goalposts move. There's always another promotion to pursue, another project to complete, another reason why this particular moment requires extraordinary effort. And even when you do have time to sleep, you often can't. Your mind races with tomorrow's tasks. Your body is wired from too much coffee and too much stress. You check your email one more time before bed just to make sure nothing urgent came through. The blue light from your phone suppresses your melatonin production, delays your sleep onset. You finally drift off after midnight and wake to an alarm at 6 a.m., having gotten maybe 6 hours of fragmented, poor-quality sleep. This is the modern version of the Sumerian worker schedule. But it's more insidious because it's voluntary, because you've internalized the logic, because you police yourself more effectively than any external authority could. You don't need a taskmaster standing over you with a whip. You have performance metrics and quarterly reviews and the ever-present fear of being left behind by colleagues who are willing to sacrifice more than you are. The research on this is clear and devastating. Chronic sleep deprivation at the population level is now recognized by the Centers for Disease Control as a public health epidemic. More than a third of American adults regularly get less than 7 hours of sleep. The economic costs are staggering. Lost productivity from sleep deprivation is estimated at over $400 billion annually in the United States alone. Workplace accidents, medical errors, traffic crashes all increase dramatically with sleep loss. But here's what's particularly relevant to our story. Despite all this evidence, despite knowing better, we continue to structure work around the assumption that 8 hours of sleep is sufficient. Corporate wellness programs might offer sleep seminars and recommend better sleep hygiene, but they don't change the fundamental equation. They don't reduce working hours to allow for 9 hours of sleep. They don't eliminate the expectation of constant availability. They don't address the root cause, which is that the system prioritizes productivity over health. This is exactly what you would expect if the 8-hour division was originally designed for workforce management rather than human flourishing. The system maintains itself, adapting to new economic conditions but preserving its core logic. Ancient Sumer had agricultural labourers and craft workers. Medieval Europe had peasants and artisans. The Industrial Revolution had factory workers. The modern era has knowledge workers. But all of them operate within the same basic temporal framework and the same division of the day into thirds, the same assumption that 8 hours of sleep is all you really need. Now let's connect this back to the Anunnaki narrative, because whether you believe in literal extraterrestrial creators or not, the mythological framework offers a useful lens for understanding our current situation. According to the texts, humans were created to bear the workload of the gods, to be a servant species designed for labour. Our entire purpose in that telling was to work. If you look at modern society through that lens, if you imagine that we're still operating under those original design parameters, suddenly a lot of things make sense. The worship of productivity, the guilt around rest, the feeling that your value as a person is directly proportional to your economic output. These aren't just capitalist ideology. They might be much deeper programming, embedded so long ago that we've forgotten its programming at all. The Anunnaki, in this interpretation, didn't need to stick around and directly control humanity. They just needed to establish the right systems, the right cultural frameworks, the right assumptions about the purpose of human existence. Once those were in place, once they were encoded into the foundational mathematics and timekeeping and social organization of civilization, they would perpetuate themselves. Each generation would teach the next. Each culture would adopt the systems from the ones that came before. The programming would run automatically, requiring no outside intervention. And 5,000 years later, you're lying here, exhausted from a day of work trying to cram your sleep into an 8-hour window that your biology knows is insufficient, following a schedule invented in ancient Mesopotamia by people who may or may not have been taking instructions from beings they called gods. You think you're freely choosing how to structure your life, but you're really just following a very old script, acting out a role that was written before your ancestors learned to write. This is the deepest horror of the story if it's true. Not that we were created as slaves, though that's disturbing enough, but that the slavery was designed to be invisible, to feel like freedom, to make us complicit in our own exploitation. We choose to work ourselves to exhaustion. We choose to sacrifice sleep for productivity. We choose to measure our worth in terms of economic output. And we do all of this voluntarily, enthusiastically even, because the alternative reflection, living in a way that prioritizes well-being over productivity, feels wrong, feels lazy, feels like we're not living up to our purpose. What is our purpose? If you ask a modern person, they'll probably say something about self-actualization, about pursuing happiness, about making a meaningful contribution, but watch what they actually do, watch how they actually spend their time, and the revealed preference is clear. Work, productivity, achievement, these are the things we organize our lives around. These are the things we sacrifice sleep for, sacrifice health for, sacrifice years of our lives for. Maybe that's just the nature of civilization. Maybe any complex society requires this kind of specialization and organization and temporal synchronization. Maybe the 8-hour division is simply the most efficient way to balance the competing demands of production and maintenance, and any civilization anywhere would eventually arrive at something similar. Or maybe it's more specific than that. Maybe this particular framework, with its base 60 mathematics and its 8-hour blocks and its prioritization of work over rest, this is a Sumerian invention that spread because Sumer was the first successful urban civilization and everyone else copied their homework. And maybe the Sumerians got it from somewhere else, from teachers they called the Anunnaki, whether those were gods or aliens or just remarkably clever humans. Either way, you're the inheritor of that system. You wake to Sumerian mathematics. You work according to Sumerian divisions of time. You sleep when you can, in blocks that roughly match what Sumerian administrators allocated for their workers. And you do all of this without ever thinking about where these numbers came from, or whether they're optimal for you specifically, or whether there might be another way to live. The really unsettling possibility is that you couldn't easily change it even if you wanted to, because the system is everywhere, because it's woven into the fabric of global civilization, because deviating from it marks you as strange, unreliable, not serious about your commitments. The schedule has become naturalized, treated as an inevitable feature of reality, rather than a human invention that could be reinvented. You're drifting now, I can tell. Your mind is letting go of these questions, sinking towards sleep. And that's good. That's what you came here for. Not answers, but rest. Not understanding, but release from the burden of having to understand. So let it go. Let the mystery remain mysterious. Let the ancient beings, whether gods or aliens or exceptional humans, let them keep their secrets. You don't need to solve the riddle of where the 8-hour day came from or why we still follow it. You just need to sleep. And maybe tomorrow, when you wake to the sound of an alarm measured in Sumerian mathematics, dividing time into units created before the pyramids, calling you back to a schedule that allocates exactly 8 hours for work and exactly 8 for everything else, maybe tomorrow you'll remember this. That the system is older than you think, that the exhaustion you feel might not be your fault, that somewhere back in the depths of history someone decided how your day should be divided, and we've been following that division ever since. But for now, let it all fade. The questions, the theories, the ancient tablets, and mysterious visitors, let them recede into the darkness where all forgotten things dwell. Your body knows what it needs to do. Your brain knows how to clear its waste products and consolidate its memories and process its emotions. Your cells know how to repair themselves, and your immune system knows how to produce its infection-fighting agents. They just need time. 8 hours if that's all you can give them. More would be better. But 8 will have to do because 8 is what the schedule allows, what the system provides, what the ancient allocation determined was sufficient to keep the workers functional. So sleep, not because you've solved the mystery, but because you're part of it. Another human, following patterns older than civilization, measured by mathematics older than writing, resting just long enough to work again tomorrow. Sleep and dream of ancient cities in the desert, of clay tablets pressed by forgotten hands, of beings that might have been gods or aliens, or just people who figured out how to organize the world in ways we still can't escape. Sleep, because whatever the truth is, whatever really happened in ancient Sumer when the first cities rose and the first work schedules were established, you still need rest. Your biology demands it, even if the system can barely accommodate it. Sleep. Let the 8 hours do their work, and maybe somewhere in your dreams, in that space where consciousness meets its ancient opposite, you'll find an answer, or you'll find peace with not having one. The night is deep and long. Tomorrow is far away. For now, there is only this, the slow descent into sleep. The surrender to a process older than your species. The trust that your body knows what it's doing, even if you don't know why you have to fit it into exactly 8 hours. Sleep. The Sumerians would tell you it's enough. 8 hours to rest, 8 to work, 8 for living. A perfect division of the day measured in their mathematics following their template. And you have no choice but to believe them, because you've been following their schedule your entire life without knowing it. So follow it one more time. Close your eyes. Let go. Sleep. The morning will come. It always does. Measured in Sumerian units, dividing the darkness from the light, calling you back to work. But for now, sleep. Good night.